Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Knowledge Cities World Summit. Yesterday, we had a wonderful beginning of the conference, and it was truly amazing to see so many people sharing their experiences from around the world. And today is going to be another intellectual banquet, the way we want to see it. We are on to the second theme of the conference, which is how islands are turning towards knowledge ventures beyond the tourism economy. Not that there's anything wrong with tourism, but the knowledge economy can produce many more riches for the country, and it's a bit more sustainable and resilient when you have issues like the pandemic that closes your shores and you are not allowed to receive visitors, right? And in that regard, we are going to have a whole bunch of presentations this morning or this first part of the day, right, depending on where you're in the world, in English. And then the second part of the day, our afternoon here in Puerto Rico, is going to be in Spanish. Remember that we are using Microsoft Teams. We emailed to all the people registered for the conference the instructions on how you can activate the captions. And if you're using the Teams application, you can even activate instant translation of the captions from whatever is the main language, in this case, English to Spanish or any other language, or from Spanish in the afternoon to English or any other language. So I just wanted to give you that note. Remember that you can use the reactions and you can use the chat to ask questions. And please feel free to write your comments as you see fit. If during the Q&A session you prefer to speak instead of typing, you can raise your hand electronically and we will give you the permission to open your mic and turn on your camera. So now please allow me to introduce you to the session chair, Mr. Güenter Koch. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, Eliut. It's a great pleasure to chair this session or to moderate this session, to better say it. And we invited a prominent speaker for this session, which is on islands, island economy, and knowledge islands, who is James Ellsmoor. And I think the best would be if he introduces himself, because he has two main functions. He is head of state of Solar, which would be an interesting explanation from your part what this means. And second, he is the founder and CEO of Island Innovation, where, this should be mentioned, both Eliut and myself are ambassadors in this period. And Stacey is our angel in the background who helps us to get engaged in this organization. I should also mention that in this session, also in the background, there is one of the assistants of Eliut, Natalie, and there may show up also Nashali. Sometimes we are confused even by these persons, but they will take care if there's any technical problem or any organizational problem in this session, you should know. Now, let me not lose too much time. Before I give James the word, I nevertheless should give a kind of an introduction on the personalities participating in this session. Different from the other days, we have not a keynote at length of 1.5 hours, rather than it's a kind of a discursive exercise where besides James and Stacey already been introduced, Eliut being the big organizational master of the conference, there is also another person, Rodrigo Trujillo, who is a partner to me in Tenerife. He is working as a professor at the local University of Laguna. And we had years of experience in setting up the idea of creating locally Knowledge Island. We had run a conference in 2018, which had even the title of being a Knowledge Island. And this was also new to the organization of World Capital Institute, because in the past, all the conferences, now this is the 15th, or the 14 other, or let's say many of the others, were devoted to cities. Now, we, Eliut and myself, lobbied hard to convince the board of World Capital Institute that also regions and islands in specific should be subjects of discussion. And so I'm happy that we this year have a strong interest, a strong accent on the island economy. Now this, just to make an explanation for those who are new in this session and also those who attend this session, there's a list of few people who may not be acquainted with what we did so far. So stop here, myself and James, if you could start to talk about the two issues you are concerned about, meaning I know that you are very much concerned since ages with the problem of climate change, and more specific, you engaged in setting up an organization which is called Island Innovation, and currently you are residing in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt at the COP27, and it would be very interesting to us to get a first-hand report from this place. Please, James, take the word. I think you have to
Thank
be
you
demuted.
so much
okay,
for that kind introduction. Please bear with me, everyone. We're facing Wi-Fi challenges, so if I turn off I might need to turn off my camera if we're struggling. But no, it's a pleasure to be here, and really happy to have this conversation. And Eliut, Güenter, everyone else, thank you so much for the efforts you've put in. My name is James Ellsmoor, as was mentioned, and I'm the CEO of Island Innovation. We are a global team, and we aim to bring together, essentially to create a platform to share information between different island stakeholders on sustainable development. So the way that we approach this is that islands, whether it's Barbados, where Stacey's joining, or Puerto Rico, the Greenland, Tasmania, Fiji, despite their obvious differences, they also share really important opportunities and challenges. And so our platform is a place to share information and to build what we call digital bridges. We do that through events, through different programs that we have throughout the year, such as the Ambassador Program that was already mentioned and that Stacey will talk a little bit about later. And also by participating in events like this. I'm here in Egypt for the COP27, hence the challenges, the technical challenges, but we'll do our best, trying to make sure that there is a opportunity for island regions to participate, to have their voices heard here, and also to send information to our audience of island stakeholders about why this kind of event is important. So looking forward to having a bit of a conversation there and to hearing from the other speakers here. Appreciate all of your flexibility. I think what is interesting here in this discussion is, especially given that many of you are joining from Puerto Rico, what is the opportunity for Puerto Rico to both learn from other islands and to share information with other parts of the Caribbean and other parts of the world, but also to share good practices that are being pioneered in Puerto Rico, whether it's the response and learnings from around renewable energy, efforts in agriculture, education, transportation. There are so many different areas. And it would be great to hear maybe some of you who are here in the chat can share what you think are the most critical issues facing Puerto Rico or whichever island you're joining from. It would be good to hear what everyone is thinking there. Güenter, you're more you're familiar with Island Innovation now. Hopefully you're able to hear all of that okay, but is there anything that I missed there?
A little bit of history would be fine, because the whole story started with a newsletter, as I read, and maybe you could tell how you came to found this organization. What was your motivation? Maybe a little bit of personal history also, because you are a cosmopolite, as I know, and you may talk about, let's say, what in your life were the insights and why you created this structure.
For sure. So I mean, on a personal level, I'm from the UK originally, and I always had this interest in, I guess, rural development and sustainability. I'm from a very rural part of the UK. And I had the interest in renewable energy, I think, first, and was very fortunate to spend several years working in the Caribbean, across all different islands, including Puerto Rico, and seeing the unique challenges that energy presents in the Caribbean region. It's kind of a fundamental that impacts all other parts of the economy. Was also then working in the Pacific and the Pacific Islands, Fiji, Tuvalu, Samoa, Niue, and New Zealand, which is an incredible part of the world. Might seem very, very distant from the Caribbean, but faces many of the same issues as well in energy. And then was fortunate enough to do my master's in an island studies program. And believe it or not, that is a real master's program that you can do on island studies. And the program was in Scotland at the University of the Highlands and Islands. It was a really incredible experience while I was working in the Caribbean to hear from islanders from across Scotland, from the work that they were doing, the challenges and the opportunities that they were seeing in a changing world. And to see how many of those conversations overlapped and had parallels with conversations we were also having in the Caribbean. So obviously I mentioned energy, but even things like depopulation and emigration, brain drain, things like the transportation challenges, obviously climate change and climate adaptation, and education, and all these other issues that are particularly specific for islands. And so Island Innovation came into being with me writing essentially a weekly newsletter on this topic, sharing stories and trying to connect different islands and good case studies. And we grew from there to have our first event, the Virtual Island Summit, pre-COVID, when these virtual events were less common. Of course, now we know that there's a lot of events like this, which is also fantastic. And we had actually 10,000 people sign up for our Virtual Island Summit in September from islands, again, across the world, sharing their stories and information and opportunities. So that was also really incredible. We have grown from there to now have a team of 16 around the world, from myself based in Portugal and 2 other colleagues in Portugal, to Stacey in Barbados, other colleagues in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, St. Lucia, St. Martin. I'm missing some. We have people in Brazil, Venezuela, Ghana, Philippines. So we also have this global organization with everyone living and working on different islands and parts of the world, plus our 400 ambassadors, which includes Eliut and Güenter, that all contribute to this network to share information and to essentially become a movement of sustainable development for islands, where we take use of technology to really change what it means to live on an island in the modern world, and what the idea of remote means, and take advantage of that to benefit island communities.
Could you, since you mentioned some numbers already, could you tell us, who we are pretty naive with the islands worldwide, how many islands are, let's say, part of the Island Innovation Organization? How many islands, to your knowledge, have their own administrative infrastructure, which makes them somehow independent? Just to give some statistics so that we get a feel for what we are talking about.
Okay, I thought you were going to ask me how many islands in the world, and I was going to say I haven't started counting them just yet. But actually, it's an interesting question, and there's no particular answer. So in our ambassadors program, we counted 250 islands out of the 400 ambassadors. In our 10,000 people signing up in September, we counted over 500 islands participating. But it actually comes down to part of the crux of the matter, which is the politics. So I'm here at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, and of course the independent UN members are all represented, and they actually make up over 1/4 of UN members are island states, from Papua New Guinea to Barbados, to Mauritius. Now, so those are a really important voting bloc at the UN, where it's one nation, one vote, and where Barbados, as I see Stacey on the screen, I'm going to keep using Barbados as my example. Barbados has the same vote as the US or China. It's one nation, one vote. So they play a huge role at this kind of event. Even though they represent over 25% of members, they actually represent 2% in terms of population. So it's an interesting place where they have a lot of power. But then comes the question, well, what about Puerto Rico? Where is Puerto Rico's representation here? And I know that's a political question, so I can also use other examples from the UK, the British Virgin Islands, from France, Guadeloupe, French Polynesia, from the Netherlands, Curacao, St. Martin. All of these, what you might call territories, have very specific needs that actually mean that they are, in many ways, more closely entwined with other islands in their region, but of course are represented by capitals that are far away and may not have the same interests. And so that's partly why Island Innovation Network works, is to create discussions between islands that might not have their own state infrastructure. And there's 100,000 levels of gray that exist between a sovereign state and local municipality, let's say. So how can Vieques or Culebra also interact with the Grenadines in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? You know, this is part of the discussion, because it shouldn't just exist at the state level. I'm purposely avoiding giving you a number here in terms of those, because again, the question is, how do you define this? And I'm often asked the question, well, what is an island? How do you define an island? And we don't have a strict definition. So, you know, clearly Australia, the United Kingdom, you could say that they're islands, but that's not what the goal is here. But Greenland is an enormous geographical space that covers, you know, a huge area. But they still benefit from participating in our network, because the challenges in Greenland, with a small population of 50,000 people spread over very small communities, are very relevant. And so we even have communities in the center of Canada, Indigenous communities that are very far from the ocean, that face some of the issues around being isolated in some way and also benefit. So my point is, it's very gray in terms of how you define this, but that's also part of the opportunity and the reason for doing what we do, to share information between islands of all political statuses, all sizes, and looking for where that is a useful comparison to be made.
Well, I think you are lobbying in favor of the islands. There is one question, because you already addressed politics. In the past, I was heavily engaged in European agendas as a former head of a large research organization working with the European Commission. And when I came to Tenerife some 10 years ago, met the people here, I discovered by discussions with European even commissioners, meaning one of those is close to me because I know him from Austria. I found out that what they call the outermost regions, they have little, let's say, ideas what to do with them, besides the fact that, for example, ESA is using it as a starting place for their space exercises, which is in Kourou, for example. But in general, if you are talking to European Commission officials talking about islands, my impression is they have little ideas on what to do with these. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. I think that's part of this question of peripherality. And of course, periphery is we're getting conceptual here. The idea of periphery is a relative term, because if you live on an island, that island is the center of the world, and everyone is far from you. And so, you know, you're far from Brussels, but maybe you could also say Brussels is far from Tenerife. It's important to think about what is that. And actually, that's part of the interesting question now of technology changing what distance means and making distance less relevant in many respects. But I think this is always the case, whether it's because of lower populations, political status, etc. Islands can get marginalized for many reasons and forgotten for many different reasons. And that varies, of course, according to their local context. So here we've been talking a lot with representations from the British Overseas Territories, which includes Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Anguilla, St. Helena, many others. There's over 12. And the fact that the British Overseas Territories were only granted 5 passes by the British government to attend the COP across all of them, despite the fact that they are the most vulnerable parts of the UK and the UK extended region to climate change, because they are small islands in the Caribbean in many cases. And so there's an inherently political element here when it comes to connecting different islands and their different political statuses and their marginalization. I do think in the European Union context, the outermost regions are an interesting group, because you have places like Micronesia, the Azores Islands, Madeira, Canary Islands, but you also have French Guiana, Guadeloupe, some very distant areas that are not in any definition in geographic Europe, but are still in the European Union. And so obviously many of those are a legacy of empire that still form part of this. And so, you know, I guess we are working with the reality of those situations, and it's important that Canary Islands and Puerto Rico can directly share information, because if that information has to go via Madrid and Washington, D.C., then clearly it reduces the opportunity for collaboration and participation between two regions that may have a lot in common.
Well, from the program, I should ask now Stacey. However, Stacey, if you allow, since some of the concerns were expressed by James, I would like to switch to Rodrigo, for the reason that he has local experience in the Canary Islands in specific, and he was also the master of a conference which we had 4 years ago in Tenerife, also addressing the questions on the role of islands within the knowledge economy. Rodrigo, would you like to make some reference also to the things James has mentioned?
Thank you, Güenter. Thank you, James and Stacey, for staying with us. I would like, more than a reflection, I would like to ask James, from his experience, his great view of all the regions in all around the world, because for me it's amazing, his knowledge. Okay, James and Stacey, I think in all the regions, island regions, appears always the confrontation between sustainability and wealth, and we are all the time fighting with respect to that. No, water supply, land conservation, energy autonomy, food production, all that the problems associated with isolated regions. No, but at the same time they're looking for the wealth, no, tourism, industry, agriculture, logistic by ports, and so. But for you, from your experience, do we have in islands a good example of successful equilibrium balance between sustainability and wealth in order to become the reference for the rest, more than Singapore, or I don't know if some kind of states totally different from a regular island, no? Do you know?
It's a very, it's a difficult question. There's a lot of examples from different islands of good practices on certain elements. Places. Oh, hello?
Yes,
we can hear you. Oops. Looks like that he's cut away. So let's take the opportunity, because James is asking if we lost him. Yes, we lost him. At least the acoustic line does not no more work. But let's take the opportunity.
Okay.
Here he's back.
I'm back. Okay. I'll just keep my camera off for a second. But just to say, there are interesting examples of good tourism or good transportation, or good, different good practices in different sectors from different places. I would never say there is one island that has solved them all. That is a unique example. So this is the opportunity. Is okay. Where is doing well with tourism and managing tourism balance? Where is doing well with energy or biodiversity or climate adaptation? So that's the interesting one. And of course, it's worth remembering one of the big paradoxes for islands is that they are extremely vulnerable to climate change, but also extremely reliable on air travel. And that is not an easy question to answer in any way when your economy often depends on tourism. So trying to find the balance between all these different areas is, of course, extremely challenging.
So it's interesting that we are about to get a better understanding altogether what makes islands so specific. And for me, it's very interesting that you made the point that islands are vulnerable specifically when it comes to climate change effects. And I think we can take the opportunity to give Eliut the word. Stacey, I keep you in the back because I think you should be the one who gives us, brings us back to island innovation with what you can tell us. But for the moment, since James made the point of vulnerability in respect to climate change, etc., I know that Eliut has quite some experience with Puerto Rico. And Eliut, if you could take the opportunity not only talk about this, rather than also about the different way Puerto Rico is making its money by settling an industry which is firsthand, as much as I know, a pharmaceutical industry in the forefront of the United States. Please, Eliut.
Thank you. Actually, I want to get to all that, but first I want to make a comment more from a philosophical standpoint. You know, last April, I went to a meeting in Tortola, and it was very interesting because it was mostly oriented to youth and to get people involved in the knowledge economy and so forth. And it was about inclusion, innovation, impact, and particularly getting girls into STEM careers and so forth. One of the points I made in that conference was the importance of getting young people engaged in internships with corporations and organizations who can help them develop skills and whatnot. And what surprised me, sadly, was that many of the young attendees didn't even know what an internship was, you know? And I realized that in smaller islands, the opportunities to engage into internships is very difficult. And crazy way, the way academic minds think, but that in a way made me think about insularismo, which is a book written by Antonio S. Pedreira back in 1934, which actually talks about, it was about Puerto Rico. It talks about how people get a tunnel mindset and they only think that their island is their universe. And when I went to Tortola, what I said to these girls and these boys who were attending, you need to look beyond your shores and try to engage in a wider network. Now, why do I mention all that? Because I think that organizations like Island Innovations actually are tackling the obligation for us to create a new mindset, which is something that Güenter and I have been talking about for several years, in terms of creating a network of islanders who want to collaborate with one another, instead of just looking at the colonial metropolis that we were probably tied to beforehand, right? Puerto Rico to the States and Barbados to England and or the Dutch or whatever, you know, depending on who your original imperial metropolis was that colonized the island, if that was the case. And I think that in the activities I've been in Island Innovations, that's something I like. People become proud of being islanders and collaborating with one another. So I just wanted to recognize that. In terms of Puerto Rico is the bigger of the Lesser Antilles and the smaller of the Greater Antilles. And that kind of defines what we are, always in the middle, kind of trying to find our space. And on the one hand, we are too big to just depend on tourism and too small to compete with a big continental economy. But over the years, Puerto Rico has developed a very strong presence in several industries. As a matter of fact, we have a higher percentage of adults with higher education degrees than the United States per capita. Because something that we have managed to do in Puerto Rico is to keep higher education affordable. And the public university is the largest university. And I know that we have someone in the audience here from UPR Mayagüez, which is has a famed engineering school that rivals Georgia Tech and MIT in terms of the innovation and the science that we produce and so forth. And what I mean by that is that when you are an island, but you don't allow your size to define you, you have the ability to grow beyond expectations. And that's what Puerto Rico has done in creating these many very well-prepared people in engineering, in the sciences, in the humanities, and in many other fields. And for many years, Puerto Rico also had the highest concentration of pharmaceutical plants across the United States. Now, we had some tax incentives from the US that allow us to do that, but eventually those went away and we got a reduction and several of these plants went away for cheaper labor. But what happened? Then COVID came and suddenly the US realized that they were relying on a whole bunch of companies from outside the US shores to produce vaccines. And that's terrible because then they are tight, right? And now there is a renewed interest in revamping again, empowering again the pharmaceutical industry in Puerto Rico. And today in the afternoon, we are going to have Ivan Lugo from Indoniv, who's going to be talking precisely about that initiative. So I urge you to join us in that panel where he's going to be talking about that. The other thing is that Puerto Rico has made a big investment in the last 10, 15 years in promoting innovation and in providing programs that would give seed money to entrepreneurs in several industries to create their business here. And today, we are also going to have people from Parallel 18, which is one of those organizations, and from the Puerto Rico Science and Technology Trust, which was created by the government and funded so that they can give big grants to organizations and entrepreneurial companies that can export and so forth. So basically, that's the key to it, right? We need to foster innovation, and that's the whole idea of today's topic. And islands can become very attractive for international banking, financing, and other organizations, investments. First, because we have a controlled environment, which can be a very good test market. Also, because we have, I love Tenerife. I love Canary Islands. I've been scuba diving in Gran Canaria. And I remember that I cataloged all the bad words and swearing words that I could remember when I jumped into that water because it was 50 degrees. My God, that was so cold, even though I had a 7mm dive suit, right? In Puerto Rico, it's 80 degrees water year-round. Barbados has the same thing. So a lot of digital nomads would like to work in island environments because they can really enjoy themselves and have a great quality of life. So I think that we have great potential, but we need to channel our investments into the knowledge economy. Thank you, Güenter. I don't know if I covered everything you wanted.
Could I just
Perfect,
comment?
perfect. Sorry, James, please.
Can I
You are
just
the
comment,
master.
Eliut? I think that was a really interesting insight. I appreciate that. It's interesting. I don't know if the word insularismo in Spanish has the same connotation, but in English, the word insularity definitely has a negative connotation, which I think is a real shame. It's kind of used as a word that means backwardness or old, behind, and it's so we often use the word islandness, which I think is a made-up word, but to try and have a word that describes islands without this negative connotation that comes. And I think I completely agree. It's so important that people living in an island community are able to connect internationally, to get inspiration and share the things happening outside. But often this is the case. I mean, many people from islands, and I'm sure this is the case in Puerto Rico, it's very standard practice to go abroad or off the island to study or for a few years to work. And so many people, many times that when I go to islands, I actually see very cosmopolitan people who have lived all over the world and have had a great opportunity. And I hopefully with this opportunity now with using digital connections, that will change even more. That we can experience the world, have a job for a big company, etc. That would not have been possible without digital connections. Maybe Stacey, I know you have some insights into these kind of conversations, and you've also lived all over the world and now work a remote job for Island Innovation. So I'm sure you have some comments on that question as well.
Oh goodness, yes, definitely. I keep thinking where to start. First of all, I could really relate to the exclamation of the swearing words when you jump into the cold water. Because I do remember one of the places I lived in for a while was Denmark, and going to the smaller islands in Denmark and going to the beach and going in the water, and it was actually quite cold.
By the way, Eliut, you should say it not in Fahrenheit, then in Celsius. So I got worried.
I know,
50 and 80 degrees.
Yeah, I know. So from another level, it really is one of those essential questions, the idea of, what makes an island an incredible place, and this idea that, there's this false dichotomy between the idea of sustainability and wealth. Because for me, coming from an island background, sustainability is wealth. Like everything that we have that can promote sustainability those are the things that make us really wealthy. And of course, it depends on how do you define the term wealth. So if you define wealth and that wealth has evolved through organizations like Island Innovation and the Ambassador Program. If you define wealth as collaboration, if you define wealth as connections and sharing knowledge and best practices and just really honing that awareness of how our uniqueness can still connect us to one another, then in islands we can span all those tensions and kind of make it something that we can thrive with. So I think that's a question we have to consider. Coming from an island, again, as James said, we do tend to have an outward vision because you're aware of those, again, the dichotomy, the idea that an island is the center of the universe, but you must look outwards. There's that diasporic element where you have family who live away, you have friends who live all over the world, and then you yourself are motivated and really inspired to seek constantly as islanders. So that's something that I think we should take advantage of in this kind of forum and hone the knowledge and the passion for knowledge that is part of being an island dweller.
Well, this idea of exchanging knowledge was a founding idea which goes back to some even more than 10 years ago, when in an organization which I was a co-founder of, which is called the New Club of Paris, we had people from islands, in specific from Hawaii, where we thought that this idea in connecting knowledge from different islands, exchanging experiences, etc., that would be a key asset of, I think, also island innovation. I think some in the back of your mind, this is the rationale for this organization, really. Now, this brings me to the point to ask the question, which was also addressed by Eliut, that a competitive advantage for islands could be to attract and or to establish knowledge institutions, say, for example, universities, or using islands as knowledge places, knowledge development places. I will give you an example. When I was together with Rodrigo organizing events in Tenerife, I made the suggestion to use an island which is limited in space, and usually it's easier to survey. Its structures usually are more simple. To use it as a living lab. Living lab is a concept which has been developed by the European in a European research program, which is more or less bringing together academia and scientific work with the real world by, let's say, having say platforms and possibilities to get people who have make the real experience connected to the academics. A typical example would be elderly home for elderly people, for example. If you want to equip it with technology to make their life easier, this is a challenge which, for example, could be could serve as a motivation for universities to develop some technologies in this respect. Now, the point I want to make, and this is more a question to all the islanders here, could an island, and this would be a positive image the islands could achieve, in specific in the world where we need a lot of new technologies for fighting climate change and supporting sustainability, couldn't islands not serve as the test lab, as a kind of a living lab where all these things can be experienced and then exported to in a greater dimension?
Actually, let me get that started, because yesterday, right here at KCWS, we had a panel in the afternoon with some scientists who are working on restoration of coral reefs. And they're doing amazing work, and they are actually using very innovative technologies, using 3D printing to create sort of vessels for coral structures to reproduce and to restore them. And something that they mentioned yesterday is that they have become a resource for many organizations, not only in the United States, but across the world, and particularly Latin America and the Caribbean and so forth. So they are innovating. They have reproduced over 100,000 fragments of coral here in Puerto Rico. They have dealt with the emergencies brought forth by the hurricanes, destroying whatever work they had done and having to restart again or recover some of the fragments who got displaced or dismounted from where they have been installed. And they are producing new science, even with community-based organizations, not even universities, because these organizations are more agile and they are getting funding and they are producing. Universities usually are too slow and don't have enough of a market mindset and to get the funding and to produce results and whatnot. And this Sociedad Ambiente Marino is the name of the organization. They're doing amazing work. So that's just one example. There are many others, but I just want to put that out there as an example, a response to what Güenter is asking.
Well, I think others can also comment on that. How can islands serve as the test bed for new ideas and developing it in examples which then can be exported to a larger dimension? James, are you still with us? Maybe you have some experience in your discussions in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Absolutely. I think
James, I think we got lost.
so. I'm careful of
Okay.
using the word laboratory.
Hmm.
I think the word lab can sometimes be a dangerous one. No one likes to be a lab rat or experimented on, but I do understand the concept. And so I've heard the term lighthouses, which I like as an example, because I think although it's semantics to an extent, the language does make a difference. And so anything that is being carried out on islands should also benefit the people living on the islands themselves, in addition to having a wider replicability in a large scale. And so there have been many examples of, I think this is very apparent in the energy sector, where you can do things on islands that would not necessarily be economically competitive on a mainland area. And so the experiments that you are able to do in terms of the energy sector are, I shouldn't say experiments, actually, I just contradicted myself, but you understand what I'm saying. The projects that you're able to initiate in the energy sector, yeah, those would not be economically viable on a mainland, but have a potential to be replicated in the future. I think the unique conditions that many islands are home to allow for things to be carried out. So waste management is another. There are big constraints in island communities for waste management. But if you can solve them in an island context, then potentially you're able to apply that in a much larger mainland area that does not have those same constraints. I think the connection is a bit dodgy, so I hope you were able to hear that.
James, is there any idea within the network of island innovation to find some common projects of that nature where, let's say, islands can profile themselves to say, okay, we are the location where you can develop these things, where we can demonstrate that this works well. Afterwards, it can be expanded to a larger dimension. Is there any idea, for example, also of having networked research programs? Maybe Stacey can jump into that. Maybe that James is disconnected.
Sure. I actually just wanted to echo James's sentiment regarding the concept of the living lab and the power of semantics and terminology. We can think of islands as well as kind of, I prefer to say, community application and implementation of certain projects and certain ideas. And the fact that often in islands, what is lacking is in fact technological infrastructure and sometimes the know-how to deal with this technological infrastructure when it has to do with renewable energy, for example. So if we can find ways to address those questions and then on that smaller scale and then create them as something that's larger and viable, that's something where islands definitely represent a key part of a continuum of creating economic strength and power. I also wanted to mention the concept of community-based organizations and actually citizen science, which I think is something that islands have multi-generational levels of citizen science that also definitely it needs to be, there has to be a level of data collection in that regard for sure, because I think that's an untapped reservoir of resilience, resourcefulness, and innovation and sustainability. That's something we have a lot to offer the world in that regard.
Stacey, that's an interesting thought. Because citizen science-ship, I know that from Austria, where I was active in that domain. And there's a lot of motivation in the population of this country to engage in type of citizen science projects. Have you any examples on your part where you can demonstrate how citizen science projects could work? For example, bird watching is typically one, and etc.
Yes, exactly. With us, yes, it does have to do primarily with ideas and behaviors of ocean species, in terms of things to do with migration of ocean species, spawning of fish, even the concept of aquaculture, which is sometimes seen as negative. It's seen as something where it's fish farming on smaller levels, and there are many examples in the Caribbean and actually in the Pacific Islands of smaller communities, smaller coastal communities, creating ways to farm fish, but in a way that's also respectful of natural rhythms and cycles of their spawning. So ways that you can enhance your food security through that knowledge and that connection of nature. I think that's something that we have a lot of technical know-how in.
Perfect to know. May I take the opportunity to ask those attending this session also to use the chat? So far, I don't see any chat contributions, but if you have any questions, maybe if there's no naive question ever, any question is welcome. Please use the chat in order to get us motivated to include you in this discussion. Since we're talking about knowledge and knowledge exchange, etc., I would like to ask to take that you, Stacey, take the floor for explaining what is the Academic Council project which we have in preparation.
Sure, that would be my great pleasure to do that. So the Academic Council is something that definitely seeks to embody everything that we've discussed when it comes to collaboration, when it comes to prioritizing island knowledge and prioritizing ways that we can share this knowledge. So one of the primary goals of the Academic Council is, in fact, to establish a greater academic focus on island communities, but to do that through utilizing island social, economic, and cultural realities as the context for exploring these topics. So rather than have an outside view, how can we explore these topics from who's on the ground and have that as a kind of a filter for how we want to explore things? We also want to use the Academic Council as a kind of a platform to provide academic institutions with a resource to disseminate research to a wider audience and make research more accessible and more relevant to island communities and concerns. That's something else that's a dichotomy that we have seen, that there's a lot of academic research, there's a lot of data collection, and it tends to occur in a bit of a bit divorced from reality. And there are many people who don't see academic research as relevant to their everyday life. And obviously we know that it is. The key is to create that connection and to see how can we make people aware that there's academic research there that really can benefit you, and you can contribute to this academic research. So that leads into one of our other goals, to maximize the impact of this academic research, making it accessible to a general audience. And then this will help create connections between various stakeholders, NGOs, community-based organizations, academic institutions. The key is about collaboration with this project, and the key is to see how can we also link this to policymakers, because we want policies to be based in relevant research that will have an effect on people in a way that's positive, and that people know that they can contribute to this research. So that's kind of an overarching view of the Academic Council and what we're hoping to achieve.
Well, I can well imagine that the council is getting things done and surveyed, but my question would go further. Is it thinkable that within that network, common projects are established, which, for example, I know it from the European Union. I don't know if there are any other sponsors. I could well imagine that, for example, if we go forward telling the European Union that islands would be prepared altogether, engaging in sustainability issues, specific projects, that there could be even raised some funding. Which brings me later on in our discussion also to the question of finance. But before we enter the finance discussion, I would put forward a question which was given by Javier Carrillo, who asked the question, and I think that's directed to James. I read it. How do you see the loss and damage claims being laid by islands at the COP27? Loss and damage, I think. Okay, James?
Yeah, absolutely. So loss and damage has been one of the key themes here at COP27. And if for those of you not aware of that term, it's essentially the question of who pays for the damage of climate change, to summarize. And so during these COPs, and I will not in any way claim to be an expert in terms of the negotiations, because as you can imagine, there's so much happening here. It's hard to keep track of everything. But that is the fundamental question that it comes down to right now. We know that climate change is happening. We know that there are adverse effects that are being already felt. Can you still hear me?
Yeah. It looks like that you get the impression, James, that we don't hear you, but we hear you. Okay, there might be an interrupt.
Now we don't.
Hello?
You are in?
You're
James,
back.
please continue. You are back. Please, we hear you. At least the surrounding noise can be heard. Okay, let's switch then until James gets back to the question he raised, and also in a way Javier raised, which is a question of how to finance climate change. Meaning, I know that in the famous Green Deal discussion on European level, there is a lot of argumentation how much money is needed. James, you are back. Please
back again.
continue. Please continue. James, please. Okay. Seems to be interrupted again. Maybe.
Sorry, we were doing so well, and well, doing our best with this connection. I think
please continue.
We have some comments on this also, if I break off again. But essentially, the goal of a number of. Stacey, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure, no problem. So I think one of the reasons loss and damage is really coming into the forefront more and more is that many island communities have called this to the fore, and I can obviously refer to our own Prime Minister, Barbados Mia Mottley, who has often, the word scathing has often been used to describe her speeches and her comments to do with funding and climate change and loss and damage. But there's an awareness of the humanity behind the climate crisis. I think that's something that island communities have pushed to show and to bring to the forefront. So loss and damage, obviously, it's a key issue, but it's a key issue because the funding is there, as we know. Often it's the access to the funding, and it's the funding mechanisms that need to be more agile and more mobile. So that's something that, again, as island communities, if we have one vote and collaboratively we aim to activate that funding and to access that funding, that's a key question, because very little can be done without proper funding. Very little can be done on a continuous basis or on a way that's consistent if we do not have the consistent access to the funding that's necessary. And this isn't just, again, it's not just a matter of lives. It's, again, as Mia Mottley would say, it's lives and livelihoods. It's a whole kind of infrastructure that's being broken down when we're at the forefront of climate change, as many small islands are. So I think loss and damage is going to continue to be a key question, I know, but it's something that if we as island communities come together and establish the need and the necessity to make the funding mechanisms a bit more agile, it's something that's going to happen, and that'll benefit everyone in the long run.
As I could observe, island innovation attracted quite a number of financial institutions being potentially interested, I guess, in business which goes along with the climate change. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
I think that one of the ways that we actually did that is that one of our flagship events, the Island Finance Forum, does seek to attract financial institutions and attract them in a way to show, well, how can they offer green financing mechanisms? How can they connect with the people and the territories that would like to take advantage of the green financing opportunities? And of course, the fact that sustainability, again, coming back to that dichotomy of wealth and sustainability is something that is profitable. It is something in the long run that is a hotbed of innovation, and something that, even from the point of view of sustainability technology and technology that's needed to combat climate change, there's a whole wealth of intellectual capital that's going to be needed to create development in this kind of technology. And this is something that we have to be aware of. It does exist. So that's where I think financial institutions and the idea of funding is seen as something necessary and that will actually become quite lucrative.
That's an interesting discussion where we could go into the details, because the community here you are talking to, meaning from the conference organizers, are very much engaged or were engaged in the history in intellectual capital issues. In specific, for example, I was engaged in a project where the idea was to change the balance regulations in the European Union, including the value of intellectual capital of organizations, which did not work, interestingly enough, because the European commissioners were against it, because they thought it's not on a sound level, etc. Do you face similar problems, meaning the financial institutions going for investments are certainly looking for, let's say, proper criteria by which they can take their decisions in order to either minimize the risk or maximize the potential profit they take out of that?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question, because it does come down to how do we actually quantify intellectual capital? Unless it's proven, unless it's manifested in a way that's solid and in a way that's really, really tangible, it is difficult to quantify intellectual capital. I think that's something that can be challenging in smaller islands, and in smaller islands as well. Often the problem with projects, it's not so much that they're not well thought through. Sometimes it's simply not, they're just not big enough. Any single island, it's often a bank will see the investment is just not something that can create big enough return. You're looking for investors who want to spend money, but the projects that they're being presented with are seen as too small to take that risk, interestingly enough. So that's where creating the collaboration amongst islands and creating collaboration to bring together projects and create a scale that's necessary to then enhance the value of that intellectual capital in turn. I think that's something we need to focus on as well.
Actually, Güenter, in that point that Stacey brings about, I think it's very important to say that a problem we usually have in intellectual capital in the islands is that the organizations sponsoring the production of these intellectual capital sometimes are foreign. So, for example, in Puerto Rico, in the pharmaceutical companies and other business companies that may have an R&D operation on the island, even though it may be produced by Puerto Rican engineers, the actual ownership of the intellectual capital is that of the foreign company. So it doesn't get recorded that that intellectual capital was produced in Puerto Rico, maybe only anecdotally in a meeting or a conference or whatever, but in terms of the permanent record, it's just the big multinational company that does that. And the other point that Stacey makes, it's critical in terms of the size of the ecosystem, the finance ecosystem, the talented staff ecosystem to actually implement and develop the companies and the monetization of the invention in the intellectual capital. So I think that probably the biggest responsibility of government and trade organizations in islands is to strengthen and to grow that ecosystem that has to be complemented among university players, finance players, simplified regulation, and of course the innovators themselves. And that usually implies that you need to reach out and get big capital from outside to validate your market and set aside specific amount of money to invest with on your island. For example, in Puerto Rico, the Bravo Group, which is owned by this family of this guy who was a big financial success in Wall Street, he decided to open a company and a foundation in Puerto Rico, and he's sponsoring big grants for entrepreneurs, and then he's also giving sustainability grants to communities so that they become more sustainable and whatnot. So he's tackling, the Bravo Foundation is tackling both components, creating permanent richness through investments in innovation and new companies, and also investing in the communities so that they become more sustainable and resilient.
I think you are addressing an interesting point, because financial institutions, at least the ones who have a potential in making investments, they are looking for, let's say, bigger projects. The reason is pretty simple, because the administration to make the investments are much easier and more, let's say, economic when you have big projects. And that raises the question, two questions. The one is, you mentioned that also some translations into the smaller sizes, in the smaller structures, is a problem to be solved. That's one thing. And the other one could be, and this is again a question to island innovation, if, let's say, connecting several islands together or several, let's say, projects of similar interest, if that couldn't create a, let's say, a critical mass so that investments are becoming interesting. So two questions. The one is the translation into smallish infrastructure, smallish sizes, and the other one is how to create big structures so that investment is more interesting. Maybe also James is back, it looks like. Yes, at least we hear you.
Yes, I can try and comment on that one. So I completely agree. In theory, the idea of aggregating projects for investments makes a lot of sense. How do you combat the issue of scale? Because ultimately, a lot of the things we're talking about is a question of scale, whether it's technological or investment applications of that. That being said, the practical challenge, if you take the Caribbean as a region, is the political element. So dealing with the Puerto Rico context, but then also the Barbados context, or different groups from different nations, trying to get any alignment that would work for finance and politics would be your biggest challenge to overcome to be able to group them together to aggregate projects.
I just received a message from Kathy Gardner, who is one of our key members in the World Capital Institute, who asked, who was mentioning different models in Cuba where all the pharma companies are state-owned. So as much as I draw a question out of that is how much government can take influence in creating structures which make it interesting for investors. Is that the question? Maybe you can open the microphone to Kathy. Kathy, she's in.
Is my mic open now?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
I'm not saying that model is necessarily correct, but they have an overarching company that manages all the pharma companies in Cuba. Cuba has been a huge leader in many pharmaceutical products since the 1980s, and provide an awful lot of medicines for poorer countries, which is where I came across this when I worked on global health. But yeah, come back to James's point, I think about the aggregation as well. Governance presents a real challenge when you aggregate different groups of islands. You know, the European Union has been funding some island innovations, but I guess they encircle it with those islands that are qualified to count as European. So the kind of governance over the islands makes a big challenge. Have you had any thoughts about how you can address that?
Maybe James or Stacey?
Well, from my perspective, what I have seen is that, yes, governance is a huge issue, and often coming from the Caribbean and being involved with people in many different Caribbean islands, at an individual level, it's often a lot easier to create the level of not just collaboration, but to create the network that's necessary to move forward and put a project together, rather than have a governmental approach. So almost a bottom-up approach is something that is much more agile.
I don't mean by governance, I don't mean governmental. I mean, how do you oversee the project?
Well, usually in our sense, some of the projects that I've been involved in with different individuals, first of all, in terms of coming together, we tend not to have a traditional hierarchical view of how we govern that project. So, and that again comes down to paradigms, and it comes down to some fundamental ideas of what leadership is. So I think that's a whole other philosophical question, possibly. But we tend to have more egalitarian ways of moving forward, and then amongst us as knowledge sharers and amongst us as experts, that's the way we found just creates an easier path to move forward.
You're also seeking funding from organizations which require that governance. So that's a big challenge.
And that's where, for example, on paper, yes, you do have a few people. When you have the project proposal, when you have the technical proposal, there's certain people who are mentioned as being the head of the project, as it were, and they have all the necessary qualifications, and then the other team members are there, and then the actual practical governance is done at a more egalitarian level. So I do agree with you. In order to be eligible for the funding, it is very necessary to abide by certain structures, and that is possible. And I have seen it in action, but again, more at an individual level.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think I'm kind of championing a bit of a change of model.
No, that's interesting. Raises the question, Stacey and James, if island innovation would consider itself to be a kind of a, how should I say, coordinator, generator of projects and investment cases, or is it not the role you have in mind?
Well,
I would say we're not the project implementer.
Okay.
We are a platform to share information, share knowledge, help connect people. We're not ourselves the people on the ground implementing projects, because part of the challenge is, of course, that we're a global network and every local context is very different. So we would never claim to be the expert in any one local context, but more trying to have that regional or international overview that allows us to facilitate those partnerships that other people are then implementing.
Okay, now we are getting close to the end of this session. We still have 15 minutes. I have to excuse Eliut. He is mastering the next session in the program, so he asked me for being allowed to step out in our group. So we are remaining between James, Stacey, Rodrigo, and myself. But I would do something which is usual in such kind of conferences, to have a kind of a final round. Starting with Rodrigo, maybe you have observed and followed the discussion and have some ideas which you put on stage. And also, since you are a member of the World Capital Institute, which can be taken as a subject of further discussions in our organizations. Please, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Güenter. Very, very, very interesting and supporting and stimulating discussion. I would like to call the attention to all of our audience that our main concern is young people. On Iceland, the young people used to live for searching for best jobs, best opportunities. So the people that we stay in the Iceland, we have to introduce most of the old ideas that now has all the participants has counted. Eliut with this supporting the knowledge economy in Iceland. But we have to prepare to these people to understand that when they go out, they must import new ideas to the Iceland regions. We have a big problems with the financing of the new ideas, because we are generating money mainly from tourists, for example, of Canary Island, but the owner of the money is living outside. So he's helping to develop the regions. From my travels all around the country and many countries, every region wants to be Silicon Valley, Iceland, the mainland, or whatever. So the plans are more or less similar, and we are fighting for the same resources. So we need people in islands that really believe in the island, and this has to be starting by the people that is from the island. So we need to generate a confidence on the possibilities of the islands, and invest in the young people to understand that they have to assume risk, they have to improve the knowledge, they have to be trained, maybe outside. Most of them has to do outside. Okay, today I have received a very, very fabulous news. Some very well-known young son of very good friends has been hired in Norway for salaries more than 70,000. We don't have people earning that money on that age here in the islands. So that is the kind of opportunities. He's going to receive a good training, to get experience. He declined offers from Japan, declines offers from Germany. So we have very brilliant people at all the regions. I don't know, we are not special, but we have to introduce that our young people have to understand that this is the place where they can play around. They have to back, in some sense, to send back ideas, to send back projects, to send back. But we have to introduce that love for the region from the school. Not essentially talk about how good is our life. What opportunity can we generate here? No, maybe recalling that USA statement. No, what can you do for your country? No, or something like that. No, okay. So I was to point out that we are to work fostering the young people to maintain here the best of one. Thank you, Güenter. Thank you.
James, if you are in, because you are not on a safe connection, I would take you next and then Stacey for the end. James, are you still with us? Looks not that he is connected, but Stacey, you can take over since
Sure.
know the organization as well. Okay.
Yes, well, I definitely want to say that that idea of fostering young people and really nurturing them and the possibility and the sense of potential and pride they have in their own regions, we definitely echo that sentiment. And that's something that even the ambassador program itself, when seen as a way to integrate and combine networking and sustainability and bringing people together, that's something that we really want to focus on. And we have been focusing on in Island Innovation, because we want to create young people who realize that they're leaders. They can be leaders in innovation, and that this is the context. Their homes and their islands. That's the context in where they themselves can truly flourish. So I definitely echo that sentiment.
James, if you are in, you have the last word, if you like. No,
I received a message that his connection has dropped, unfortunately.
Okay. Anyway, I want to thank those who are still on the panel. Stacey in specific, James, who is absent currently, Rodrigo, as well as Eliut, who is already in the next session. I must say that although I'm trying since 10 years to understand the peculiarities and the specialities of islands, I have learned a lot of things today. I'm also happy that the discussion was so vivid and that we had no pauses in ideas, etc. I should also say that my appreciation for island innovation is so high because it already turned out, and Stacey, you may have notified it, that, for example, I took up contact with Diana Körner for discussing smooth or sustainable tourism. And interestingly enough, other people from the network jumped into that, because it's one of the projects certainly which are in the large list of, let's say, common interest of islands, which we may hopefully found some common project, maybe with some funding even. And I think that what I understand also is that island innovation plays the role of being a catalyst in this respect. And I think this is a great idea. I like it very much. And I give you, meaning I wish you all everything what I can wish that the Island Innovation Program is continuing to be successful. I'm quite sure if they have people like you, Stacey, it will happen. And James, as the founder as well, happy to have you met and have made contact with you. I should also say, as a very last word, that I observed in the Canary Islands that some 10 ambassadors are part of the infrastructure of the structure. And there's another person, Melanie Symes, who is currently about to found a kind of a subgroup, if you may, I may call it, or a kind of a local community
yes.
by which we want to cooperate. because Canary Islands are spread over in meanwhile 8 islands. Up to now it were counted 7 because the 8th island is a little one, but has its own infrastructure. And so we consider ourselves, on the one hand, the Canary Islands to be a typical, as I said, you may not like it, but it's a kind of a test bed. And in the larger extension, Macaronesia, which includes also, and James mentioned it, the Azores, Madeira, Canary Islands, and Cabo Verde, which forms, let's say, a new large region in the Atlantic. And I'm confident that, since I also mentioned that attention is being paid more to the islands through your organization, as well as by our interventions to the European Commission in our case, that we will raise interest in order also to raise some new funding programs, starting with fundings for research and development, so for the knowledge development in specific. And as said during this conference, universities and similar institutions, research centers will certainly play a major role. And I support you in any way we can do. And if you take in your mind, Stacey, that the Canary Islands would be very happy to be part of your council, academic council, we would be happy to be included. So this is my last word. So if you have any statement, Stacey, we are not yet at the very end. You can.
Well, I was just going to say that with actually ambassadors like yourselves and Eliut, that's one of the reasons that we're doing as well as we are, this consistent collaboration. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Melanie, because I actually have been in touch with her, and I have a meeting scheduled with her tomorrow for us to continue this sense of collaboration and to keep moving forward with some positive momentum. So thanks so much on behalf of James and myself for allowing us to be part of this forum. It's been really wonderful, and we've appreciated the chance to get together and once again to collaborate. Mm-hmm.
And if you are looking to the chat, Eliut already made an announcement on the next panel discussion, which follows this one. So you should know, everyone who is in this meeting, that each of the sessions has its own link. So you have to look up in the conference program and take the link. The one which is now chaired by Eliut is indicated in the chat. Thank you very much for your engagement, for your time in specific, and hope to see you soon on the next occasion. Also take it as our offer that we engage in any of your programs, and you can also take the intellectual power of our group. Okay. Thank you very much.
Everyone. Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.